School finance is a bit complicated and confusing, and we will not be able to cover all of it today. But I hope that you come away with a better understanding of the big picture and how it impacts all of our lives. We want to start with some facts to frame the conversation. And the first fact is the school finance system in Texas was created in 1993. It is outdated. We all know that. In 1999, Texas was ranked 32nd in school spending. Now it's ranked 43rd. So you see the trend. The current school financing system supports more than 5.3 million students and 1,200 school districts and charters. This is a huge operation. Funding education is a shared responsibility between local property taxpayers and the state of Texas, but the state's been reducing its share of the school funding for quite a long time, and as of 2019, local property taxes cover 62% of all school funding. So the billions saved from property taxes go to other things in our state budget. Although recapture of the Robin Hood Plan was created to equalize funding for schools by sharing tax wealth, both recapture districts and non-recapture school districts are suffering right now under those constraints. So the current education system is underfunded, inadequate, and inequitable. There is hope, though, and we're going to talk about that today. There are two bills, one from the House and one from the Senate, currently under consideration at the Texas Capitol, and we'll take a little bit deeper dive into what those could mean if they do pass and if we can find some compromise. But now let me introduce you to our panelists who will put all this in a little better perspective for us and boil things down and look at short-term and long-term solutions to school finance, because this is not a one-time fix. This is something the state's going to have to do continually every 2 years when they meet and probably in between. So first, we have Kelly Crook. She is the superintendent of Del Valley Independent School District. Then we have Drew Sherberly. He is the senior vice president of policy and advocacy at the Austin Chamber of Commerce. And next to Drew is Chandra Villanueva. 2 years of college Spanish, and it takes me 3 tries to pronounce the last name, right? She's the program director of the Economic Opportunity Team for the Center for Public Policy Priorities. Thank you for being here, Chandra. Then we have Amanda Brownson. She is the associate executive director of government relations at the Texas Association of School Board Officials. So you see we have a very broad variety of folks up here come at this from different perspectives. And of course, you met Brian Hill down on the end, and he'll be chiming in on some things that relate to AISD. As we said, this is a tough topic to grasp. I'm going to shut up and let these people give you the information that you need. But I just have to say one thing before we start. We should all care about this topic. We're talking about our children, our nieces and nephews, our grandchildren, future generations, the quality of their education, and eventually the quality of our workforce in Texas. So that's why we're boiling down the mathematics today. It may sound like a topic that's wonky, but it's really a topic that we need to think about from our heart as well. So I'm going to begin by asking each of you to answer 2 questions, and I've been told to remind you to keep this particular answer brief. Kelly? Like 1 to 2 minutes. So here's the twofold question. Why has it been so hard to fix school finance when this is really about giving children in school districts resources that they desperately need? And how does your particular job and experience influence how you view this particular issue? And Kelly, we will start with you.
Okay.
And I'll give you a wrap if you go too long. You asked me to do that.
I did. No, I actually did. Can y'all hear me okay? Okay. Thank you. On the first question, why is this so difficult? I think from a practitioner standpoint, no other service that we provide, no other public service that we fund is so personal to each and every one of us. And just to give you an example, I want you to think of what you would consider your immediate family members, your grandparents, your parents, your aunts and uncles, brothers, sisters, kids. Just in this room, how many of you have a firefighter amongst those groups? Got a couple. What about a law enforcement officer? Got a few more. What about an educator, a teacher? Look at that. Almost every hand in this room went up. Every time I meet a legislator from anywhere around the country, whether they seem to support public ed or don't seem to support public ed, the first words out of their mouth, my mother was a teacher, my grandmother was an educator. And so it's something that actually connects all of us. And most important, it involves your children. It's very personal. But yet, it is something that we cannot agree on how to fund. And I think that's part of it. I think it's that personal nature. When you look at education organizations will survey Americans, and they'll say, give a letter grade to the public schools nationwide. They always get a D or an F. And then they'll say, give a letter grade to your kid's school. And they're all an A. So we love our own school, but everyone else out there is doing a terrible job. And every one of us answers the same way. And I think what we've spent a lot of time on is thinking about our own schools and what we need and what our children deserve. And we haven't made that leap to, this is a shared responsibility. And what do all children deserve? For the second question on my experience, I grew up in Austin. I was born and raised in Austin. I graduated from Austin Public Schools along with all three of my sisters. And now I'm superintendent of a school district that is 96% children of color, 88% economically disadvantaged. There is no city of Del Valle, so a lot of the responsibilities that a city would provide for their school district, we don't have. We are 174 square miles, and we have no grocery store. We don't have a hospital. All of the social services that we take for granted, we don't have them in Southeast Travis County. And so I'm leading a school district that is very, very different from my own experience. And that has helped broaden my perspective to understand this is a responsibility that affects this state. I don't have children of my own, but I proudly pay property taxes because somebody paid taxes for my sisters and I guarantee you, housing values back in the 60s, my parents didn't pay near enough to have covered the cost of our education. And I hear that all the time. My taxes are too high. Why should I be paying for other people's children? Because someone paid for you, and that's what we do. But we've got to acknowledge and get past the personal and understand the global, that this affects everyone. This affects our businesses, this affects our very livelihood in this state. I know, I was like 1 to 2 minutes, thank you. I appreciate that, Linda.
You went a little over, but you were great.
Thank you.
So I'm going to switch places with Chandra then. I think in brief, I couldn't improve on that. So I would only say that on behalf of employers, that we'd like to make sure that the people who grew up here.
Yeah, point it up a little bit, Drew. There you go.
Doesn't actually get any better if it's magnified. That we, as employers, we'd like to be able to employ the people who are here. We're in one of the most dynamic economies in the world. South by Southwest is here looking to change everything about how we do business. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are going to change every industry. And so in addition to everything that Dr. Crook just said, is to make sure that that our young people are sufficiently prepared for this very rapidly changing world.
Chandra.
Thank you. I think why it's so hard to address this issue really does come down to revenue and sort of the anti-tax sentiments within the state of Texas that we've historically had. We broke off from Mexico to become our own country because we said we wanted a system of public education. It took us something like 100 years to figure out how to do that after that. So we've never really wanted to put the revenue behind educating our kids. Even when we first created our school finance system in 1984, well, at least our more modern system, the legislature funded it at 76% of what was recommended, and nobody wants to raise the revenue to support our education. And so we need to look at our revenue picture as a whole if we want to fix this, because right now we're pitting healthcare against education, basically telling the citizens of Texas that you can only have one, health or education. And we are a really wealthy state, and it really needs a revenue system that can meet all of our state's needs. So that's one of our big focuses at the Capitol, is not just trying to improve how we fund our schools, but ensuring that our state has all of the resources it needs to meet all of the needs of the state.
Amanda.
So for me, and kind of similarly, why it's so hard is I think two things. One is it's expensive. We're a very big state. We educate 5.4 million children. Just in the FSP, on the maintenance, that's the foundation school program, the main sort of state aid system, we're spending $40 billion a year. And so you can spend a lot of money in this system, and it doesn't move the needle very much. And so as lawmakers try to solve problems, the cost grows very quickly. And secondly, it's very complex. So I started my career teaching in an urban school district in California, in Los Angeles. And then I came back to Texas and taught in Thrall, where we had probably 60 children a grade, 30 children a grade. And so in a state like Texas, where you've got really both of those kinds of school districts, trying to create a system that solves problems for all the school districts in Texas is really challenging. And so prior to going to the School Business Officials Association, I worked at the Texas Education Agency. And in both roles, my job's been to sort of work with all districts in the state, regardless of wealth or size. So we've got a lot of variation. We've managed to create a system where all school districts somehow feel uniquely disadvantaged, right? But that's because they see it through their own lens, trying to solve the problems they're trying to solve. And so I think that this combination of complexity and size just genuinely makes it a really challenging thing for lawmakers to tackle.
Brian, do you want to add anything from your perspective?
Sure. I think your question about why is it so hard, I don't think it is really that hard. I think we've spent so much time and so many years not properly funding public education, and we've done really well in the state for the most part, that we feel like, well, if they can make it work with the funding that we're giving them, then why would we put more into it? But now it's starting to catch the attention of folks across the state that we actually aren't funding public education the way we should. I think you said 43rd earlier when we were comparing all states. And so the question is, how do we put more funding in, and are there going to be strings tied to that funding? There seems to be a lack of trust for public education. It's, well, we'll give you more money, but we're going to tell you what to do with it, instead of actually trusting the folks that are on the ground to do what they need to do with that money. So I don't think it's that difficult. We need more funding. I think everybody can agree on that. It's just whether or not that's actually going to happen this session. I think it will. And then will those strings be tied to it? And to your second question, for me, I work in education. I was a teacher. I was a principal, and now I'm working in the superintendent's office. And my wife was a teacher, and I've got friends that are still teachers. If you ask them, they're not getting paid enough. They think that there should be more funding put into education. They've been saying that for years. We need more money we need more resources to be able to provide the supports that students need, especially in the city of Austin. And so we've been saying this for years, and I think folks are finally starting to pay attention. And so again, the question is going to be, will we actually do something this session to really put funding back into education that we should have been doing for years and we haven't been doing?
So I want to drill down on what's happening at the state capitol right now. I know yesterday was the first day of the public hearing on House Bill 3, and this is the one that's gotten the most attention. It's $9 billion. It would deal with school finance reform, supposedly sending more money to public schools and lowering your property tax rates. Who wants to explain how this particular bill could change the recapture system that we rely on right now, the so-called Robin Hood plan? And just a footnote, if you want to read this bill, if you're really that wonky and you want to read the whole bill to understand it, it's at www.thetexasplan.com. but we all need to get a little wonky because it's all about money, right? So who wants to talk about what HB 3 might mean to the way we do it now, the way we fund schools now?
Want me to try?
Get it,
I'll give it a shot.
Go ahead, Amanda. We believe in you.
So I, the first thing probably that you guys would care most about is the bill does reduce recapture. So that's probably the big news for this room as folks who live and work in Austin, is that I think the bill would lower the size of Austin's recapture and pretty significantly. It does change the mechanism for calculating recapture. I'll try to give you like a 2-sentence explanation of how we do it now and how we would do it. I don't know how much you care about the details. Now, essentially, the state defines how wealthy it says you're allowed to, the wealth level at which you're allowed to experience revenue. And to the extent that you have more property wealth per student than the state's allowed limit, it says you have to send back that percentage of your tax collections. So if in Austin you are 45% wealthier than the state says you should be allowed to experience, you would send back 45% of your M&O tax collections. Under the new system, I think what I think is they're building what they always thought they had, because it's really the shorthand way most of us have explained school finance to a lay audience, and then when they find out that's not exactly technically how it works, I think it's frustrating. And so they're actually putting in statute what I think they thought they always had, which is the state will define an entitlement per student. So how much do we think it costs to educate every child? And then you think of that as a bucket. That's how we all have always told them it works. You think of that entitlement as a bucket, and you fill it up with your local tax collections. To the extent that those tax collections overfill that bucket, you would send the resulting recapture back to the state. But because they've done two things, right? They've grown the size of the bucket. They've said every child's worth more in the system, and they've lowered your property tax rates. Both of those things combine to reduce the amount of recapture Austin would be sending back to the state.
But isn't the state filling the bucket a little bit less and local districts are filling it more?
That happens under current law every year as property
Okay.
values
I just want to
grow.
make
That
sure I'm getting the
absolutely
visual
happens.
here.
Yeah. So if you imagine on a going forward basis, as property values grow, then you're right. Those local tax collections will grow along with that. And so unless either the size of the bucket grows or lawmakers come in and say we're going to reduce property taxes, then you're right. Sort of set on autopilot, the system reverts toward a continuing increase in local share, which is why, I would say school finance isn't something you do once in a generation and you set it on autopilot, or once every 10 years and you set it on autopilot. And unfortunately, as unpleasant as it is, it's something we have to do every session and come back and course correct and think about our state's needs and work through.
Yeah, and in this bill, they also, though, have a provision that'll help at least keep track of the declining state share and make recommendations for keeping up with the state's level of investment. So it requires the Legislative Budget Board to report what is the state local share, how much is the state share declining due to rising property values, and then suggesting what the compressed tax rate should be, what we should lower tax rates to keep the state share at the level that it was, I guess, whenever they passed this bill. And achieve it. So that is a really good move forward too, at least acknowledging that the state share does slip when local property values increase and trying to maintain this level of investment. Because I think that was one of the things that happened in 2008 was when we compressed tax rates by 1/3, the state didn't do anything to maintain that level of investment. So property values just continued to rise and the state's share continued to decline. So at least there's an acknowledgement of that happening and trying to kind of rectify that in the system.
So I think to put it into dollars for taxpayers is that the Austin taxpayers next year, so FY20, would send roughly $800 million to the state of Texas. And to put that into perspective, we could have almost bought in cash the AISD bond that we did 2 years ago. Take about a year and a couple months. It's an enormous amount of money. It represents more than we spend for City of Austin taxes. It's more than we spend for Travis County taxes. So next year, if you're an Austin ISD, if you're the medium homeowner, your taxes would go up about $320. Under House Bill 3, your taxes will go up $220. And that's the tax cut that's being proposed currently with a statewide compression of tax rates. So it's not going to change the trajectory of affordability, and we'll be back to the current level of recapture in maybe a year or two, depending on that. And this is a long process. It's a long process. The Speaker, the Chair of House Public Ed deserve an immense amount of credit. There is a lot of good in this bill, and primary among it is that for Austin ISD, on a budget of $760 million or so, is that around right, Brian? Mm-hmm. It would be about $100 million in additional authorization in the way it's filed today. So it's a very sizable increase in the investment in public education in its initial form. It doesn't do much to change the affordability trajectory that you're facing today.
But if you're talking about, I'm going to speak as a selfish homeowner right now, who lives in Austin and pays a lot of money in property taxes. If our property values continue to escalate, this relief isn't really going to be very much money, 4 cents per every $100 of value. So, I mean, if we talk of these areas in Austin, I mean, we are facing these escalating huge increases in our value. So our bottom line,
which are not set by your school districts and your taxing entities.
Well, talk about that.
And
explain that to us.
That's something that when people come to us as a school district, my taxes are too high. And then when they talk to their legislators, well, somebody should do something about cutting your tax rates. It's not the tax rates that are the problem. It's the value of your home, which is set by the appraisal district. We don't have any control over that any more than any other taxing entity has control. And so we're always going to have this push-pull where people are going to talk about, well, we're going to take 4 cents off your tax rate. If something isn't done about appraisal value, then it's not going to show any relief. And then, as we were talking about this earlier, but so do we limit appraisal values? Do we come in and say, well, the equity in your home, now we're going to take that away? Now your home isn't worth as much? And then where's our revenue stream going to come from? We talk about being a very wealthy state. We are a very wealthy state. But why are we a wealthy state? Because we've got a lot of increased property value going on in this state. So it gets back to what we were talking about earlier. It's not that simple when you start. It's not something that we all agree on fundamentally. And I mean, I was CFO before I was superintendent, so I embedded myself plenty in the finance system. But as superintendent, I still think we've got to work on our mindset before we start delving into numbers. We have a system that basically funds you by your number of students. If you have this many students, you should get this much money. If you have more students, you should get more. And yet we have districts, if you're losing enrollment but growing in property value,
like Austin,
why should you get more money? And don't throw your stuff at me. I am an Austin ISD graduate and taxpayer, so my taxes are going up too. But that's what I mean by we're not getting back to the fundamental concepts. We're spending a lot of time on tax rates and values and formulas and how much is this child worth, but we still haven't coalesced around what's important to us and what we believe. And we do this a lot in schools. We set our goal statements before we start getting down to what should the curriculum be and what should be working toward. And I don't think we've done that as communities and as a state around what we believe about public education, and I think we need to do that first.
I want to know what the audience is sending in for questions. Brian, if you could share a couple of those with us.
She talks longer than 2 minutes.
There's actually a lot of great questions. This one is interesting. It says, has the legislature considered dipping into the ever-growing rainy day fund to help with public school finance? So has that been considered, and do y'all think that that's a good idea?
And somebody might want to to start with explaining the rainy day fund a little bit because not everybody knows what that is.
Yeah, it is raining.
Yeah, look out.
It's raining outside, so
Yeah,
let's make a fund.
so the rainy day fund is actually the economic stabilization fund, and it was created to basically stabilize the economy so that when we see ebbs and flows that we don't have to make drastic cuts in state services. Unfortunately, the legislature has been very hesitant to tap into this piggy bank, and now it has $12 billion, $14 billion, something like that. So we have a huge pot of money. And one important thing to know about the rainy day fund is they should have spent it in 2011 instead of cutting $5 billion from our schools, because that was because of an economic downturn and we had the money in the bank and that never needed to happen. So I'm hoping now that they've learned their lessons from 2011 and will look at that as a source of revenue. There's definitely been some proposals to tap it for some Hurricane Harvey relief efforts. There's been some proposals around TRS Care, our retired teacher system. The healthcare in there is always on the brink of bankruptcy, so there's been some talk of that. And Senator Betancourt has a bill right now to actually increase the homestead exemption, which helps with that value growth that we were just talking about, to kind of rein that in. And he would make up the revenue lost through the ESF, the Economic Stabilization Fund as well. Is there any other bills?
The other idea that's floating around is the Legacy Fund, which the Comptroller's Office has talked about. Which is to really begin to take a portion of that rainy day fund. The frustrating part for folks from the Comptroller's Office that look at this is we have all this money in a rainy day fund, but we keep it in relatively short-term investments that don't generate a lot of interest income. And so his question was, if we're going to have a fund of this size, can we begin to invest it in more robust kinds of investments and then take the interest from those the returns on those investments and use them to productive ends. And so I think they are beginning to have those conversations. I think the other idea that came up this time was to use it for school safety. They're thinking about sort of one-time kinds of expenditures, the idea being we don't want to build an ongoing cost with a one-time source of revenue. But I agree with you that the concept of the fund was to really spend it in economic downturn times, not I mean, actually right now the economy's running fairly well.
Well, and on that, we have something similar. We always get people coming to us with our fund balances. You've probably done it to Austin ISD. I get it from people with Del Valley ISD. Why are we cutting? Why aren't we spending our fund balance? And, you know, not to play devil's advocate, but just like the state's rainy day fund, there's not a guarantee that it renews itself every single year. So just like as a school district, when we say we don't want to pay for recurring costs out of one funding source that may or may not replenish itself, we also need to be careful about that. That's not the silver bullet that's going to fix everything, because we hear that all the time. We'll just spend the rainy day fund. And do you know how many costs we have in education that are recurring? You just normally think of personnel. Yes, personnel are recurring expensive costs. One of the largest costs I have now is technology. It doesn't last very long. It really doesn't last very long in the hands of children. When you buy a set of computers for your business, you've probably got some employees that are still working on the same ones 5, 8, 10 years later. We get new kids every year. Every year we have to replenish everything. These are very, very high costs that were never built into the formulas. The old textbook allotment did not anticipate the technology age. And so we do have to be careful of thinking that that's the answer for everything, to just, well, if we pull it all out of the rainy day fund, we'll be fixed. Like Amanda said earlier, this is an every year problem and needs to have an every year funding solution.
Did you want to add to that, Drew?
I wanted to just provide, from a taxpayer standpoint, a homestead exemption. Democrats proposed increasing the homestead exemption from $25,000 to $50,000. That would be roughly about $300-ish. The Senate, Senator Betancourt suggested to raise it from $25,000 to $35,000. That'd be roughly about $140 tax cut. That would be a one-time, you know, and then it would go back at the same amount. The other idea that's been very quietly discussed is that the Commission on School Finance put together, for the edification of the legislature, a number of potential revenue enhancements and said, here are things that you could consider to increase at the state level so that you could further cut taxes at the local level. And that way you can get to some of the affordability questions that are out there for you. And so I would say one of the upcoming potential fights is how you compress local property taxes. If you're trying to do it across the board, then we're going to see little to no impact. And no one is crying for those areas like Austin, where we've been seeing a $1,400 tax increase in the last 4 years, and almost all of that's gone to the state. No one's cried about that in the rest of the state. Similarly, they don't care whether we get any impact on a property tax cut, but if we target those areas that are seeing the biggest property tax increases, like basically all of Central Texas, then you would actually see a reduction in the amount of money local property taxpayers are paying into the system and still getting more education benefit.
I would just, I think the challenge there is that we have a long constitutional history in Texas, starting with litigation in Edgewood, one, that says school districts that are willing to tax themselves at a similar rate should be able to provide for a similar level of education. And so this litigation stemmed from Edgewood sitting next to Alamo Heights, and Edgewood had a much higher property tax rate than Alamo Heights did, and the court said that's unfair and it's inefficient. It's inefficient that businesses would then choose to locate and invest, right, in the district with the lower property tax rate, and it creates inefficiencies in the system. And so it's going to be a challenge that I think lawmakers will have to balance if they think about lowering rates in some parts of the state and leaving them high in others.
And let me belabor it because it's going to be a big issue in the next couple weeks, is that the Edgewood decision said that if you had different tax rates necessary to provide a general diffusion of knowledge, that it was unconstitutional. And at the time, 1989, you had a 60% differential in tax rates. How boring is this? Today, you've got a 10% differential, and nearly everybody is achieving the state's definition of a general diffusion of knowledge. So there is an argument that we don't have to maintain some level. We could maintain a level somewhere between 10% and 60% because we have attained the general diffusion of knowledge as defined by the legislature.
And do you guys feel like we've got the general diffusion of knowledge in terms of what we're providing for our kids?
And then there's the whole equity argument.
Right. Yeah. And
Well,
I think
I want to talk about equity, but go ahead.
Okay, yeah, no, and I think it is really important that all communities put in the same effort to support education. Unlike other kinds of services, every kid is guaranteed a quality or a general diffusion of knowledge, not necessarily quality education. We guarantee a bare minimum. But it's important that every community put the exact same effort into that. And so every community everybody taxes roughly at $1 per $100 of value, but it's the state that hasn't been putting in their fair share. So instead of the state really upping its investment, which can help lower property taxes for everybody, they're floating these ideas of differential compression so that an area like Austin could go down to as low as like 38 cents in theory, while other areas would still be taxing at $1. But it's important that all communities put the same effort in supporting education because all kids, no matter where they live, are guaranteed the same education. And that's why the state, brings up the bottom and brings the top down. And unfortunately, we bring the top down a lot better than we bring the bottom up. And that's why recapture's gotten out of control. And that's why there's a lot of distrust in our school finance system, is because the state's not putting in their fair share and we're just bringing the top down.
Interesting. So we've been talking a lot of money. I want to get a big picture perspective again because this formula is totally outdated that we're using. It's not working. We all know that. But how can this change in the way we pay for public schools and some of the proposals that we're seeing at the Capitol today lead to a more equitable system and help children all over Texas improve their education and in turn eventually, hopefully, improve the workforce? I mean, that's what it's all about. We all want the students to get a quality education and see them do well. So could these new proposals make a difference?
I will say this. I would like to commend the legislature for what I think has been, as I sat and watched, and I will admit, having done this for a while now, I tend to approach things with a little bit of skepticism. But having sat and watched the School Finance Commission deliberate, having sat through, how many hours did we go? 12 hours of testimony last night on the school finance bill.
I testified at 11 o'clock last night.
I think
Need some more
that they really
coffee?
have spent a lot of time thoughtfully talking about the needs of children living in poverty. And I think it's genuine. And so I think what they're talking about doing in terms of investing, particularly in programs for children who are maybe the neediest in our system, I find really encouraging, and I'm excited about some opportunity there.
Yeah, I mean, I did testify in support of HB3 last night at 11 o'clock at night or something like that. It is a good step forward. There is actually some real new dollars, and I've been doing this work almost a decade now, and this is the first time the legislature has actually tried to put some real dollars behind their proposals. Unfortunately, it's all still very arbitrary.
Yes.
They put a lot of money into the basic allotment, but they've done nothing to figure out what does it actually cost to provide an education. And they set the basic allotment at $6,030 to kind of a nod to the higher ed coordinating board's 60 by 30 plan, where they want 60% of adults to have a degree or credential by 2030. So it's a very gimmicky basic allotment, and it is the linchpin of everything that our school finance system is based on. That's what all of the adjustments are based on. That's like the primary building block. And it's a completely gimmicky, arbitrary number that is completely meaningless. And so now one of my big concerns is that number going to stay that way until 2030, until we have another gimmick to set the basic allotment against? And so I think that's something that they really need to do, though, is do a cost study and figure out what should we be putting into our schools for resources. But this bill is a really great first step, and a lot of the things that they're doing are way overdue.
She is so awesome.
Brian, I know we have some more questions coming in.
So this question asks, are there states that are doing it well, and what are some things that we could replicate from those states that are doing it well?
Good question.
Yeah,
Who can
don't
make
keep
coffee?
looking down here.
Well-
Until a bill is passed, I have to be nice to both houses.
Well, I can just say, when I was a graduate student at NYU, we learned that Texas has the best school finance system in the country.
What year was this?
This
We're
was,
done.
Yeah, like probably 2006. But we do have a good philosophy. We were one of the first states to recognize that different students need different levels of resources to be successful. So we were one of the first states that did that. Recapture is actually an amazing, innovative, great way to deal with property value disparities. So those were the kinds of things that we focused on. But again, the system, it's outdated, it's underfunded. So while we have a good foundation that does need some cleanup, and there's a lot of that good technical cleanup in HB3, our real issue is revenue and adequacy. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel with our school finance system. There is a lot to build on, and I think that's just really important to know, that we actually have some good things going on in Texas, and we should be proud of the things that we have going on.
I would just say, too, when you go to sort of national school finance conferences, it's a little bit reassuring. Most states rely to a large degree on property taxes. They have different mixes of state taxes that they use to supplement that, and many of them struggle with very much the same issues that we're struggling with. And so it's almost reassuring to hear that sort of we're not alone in kind of the challenges we face. I mean, these are issues that are hard to solve and that states across the country struggle with.
Yeah, 46 states use systems very similar to ours called foundation school programs with weighted funding and things like that. So there's not a whole lot of real variation on how schools are funded across the country.
But don't some of these states have state income taxes? And would that, I mean, I know that it's against the Texas Constitution to have a state income tax, but is that making, I know, dare I even say the word out loud?
I mean, it's not
but
actually, it's not prohibited. It's just that voters have to approve the income tax, and it's
Right.
just that the legislature will never let us vote on it. And our income
Okay, that's
tax,
a good clarification, yes.
Right, and our income tax is actually structured so that I think, 2/3 goes to property tax relief and the other third goes to schools. So it's kind of like this hidden Easter egg in our Constitution that we just need to sort of crack open and solve all our problems. But, the easy
You go ahead
solutions
and keep
are the
lobbying
hardest.
for that. We'll be watching. Brian, do you have another question from the audience?
Sure. So this question asks, is $9 billion enough? And if not,
No.
how much is enough? And they pointed out that they said that it would take $44 billion to get us to an average state spending, national average. So, yeah, is $9 billion enough? And if not, how much is?
Oh, good
I think
question.
the answer is we don't know. You know, first of all, it's hard to know. There are several ways you can go about trying to study this, that academics try to study it. They often come to different conclusions. So it's hard to know, and your belief system and your research methods will impact the answer you come to. We haven't really asked that question in a little while, but it's certainly a helpful start, and one for which I will say thank you.
So I want to talk a little bit about the Senate bill and how it differs from the House bill. So this is going to get a little bit into the weeds, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you guys know so much more about this than I do, but it's my understanding that the Senate bill would increase funding based on how economically disadvantaged students perform and how graduation ready they are. So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on rewarding outcomes as a way to reform funding? Does that make sense?
You can take
Yeah.
that, Drew.
So, over the last year, the state had something called the Commission on School Finance, and we were well represented in Central Texas. The chair of it was from Georgetown. The Austin ISD CFO, Nicole Conley, was a part of it. The Pflugerville superintendent, Doug Killian, was a part of it. The recommendations that they came out with were unanimous, and you'll see that different components of the Commission's recommendations have been put into different legislative vehicles. A number of those were in House Bill 3. Two that were not, that are in the Senate bill, are tied to recognizing school districts where students are reading on grade level at the end of third grade and students who are graduating college, career, and military ready. And this is part of one of the things that the chair said on multiple occasions last night in House Public Ed and during the day and probably earlier in the morning, was that it's a complex puzzle, and it hasn't been solved for the last couple of sessions because people haven't been willing to compromise. And part of the compromise has been there is a contingent in the legislature who are saying they would like to make sure that more investment yields more academic outcomes, and this is the way that they see that happening. And so that is in the Senate bill. It is not currently in the House bill. The chair of House Public Ed did say yesterday he is working on ways to bring that back into the bill, but didn't specify anything publicly that I heard.
Let's talk about the concept just a little. I spent 10 years in the corporate world before I lost my mind and went back to school to become a teacher. I understand accountability, and I understand the need that if you're going to invest in something, you want a return. That makes perfect sense to everybody. Whenever people say, oh, they should just give us money and let us do whatever we want, well, that's crazy, and I understand that, and we understand that. And I have no interest in spending $108 million every year of Del Valle ISD's taxpayers' money and saying, how are the kids doing? I don't know. I hope they're doing really well. I get that. I was a former finance person. I wouldn't do it. But we have to look at the difference between what you're dealing with. We're dealing with children. We're not dealing with a situation where if this employee is doing a good job and has good outputs and this one is not, well, that's easy. I'll send this one on their way and I'll reward this one. Where would you like me to send the children that aren't successful? And to tell our teachers, look, we're going to put a system together where if our students aren't succeeding, and you know the challenges we come in with, if our students aren't succeeding, we're going to get less money. If the students over here are doing well, we're going to reward them with more money. I'm offended by the notion that my teachers are not doing everything they can right now. That offends me. So the idea that if I would dangle money in front of them, they would all of a sudden care and get to work. And if that doesn't offend every teacher in every district, then I don't think you're in the right business. Because the idea that somehow we're going to get after it if there's finance involved. what it becomes is just like the Edgewood situation. You become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If my kids need 3 extra years to make 1 year of growth because of the challenges that they're coming in with that are not their fault, then we're not going to make those metrics on the same timeline. We get them there in the end, and the chamber will back us up. We actually have a very good graduation rate in Del Valley, but it takes a long time and a lot of extra work and a lot of extra resources. But if I start losing money or not able to give bonuses because the results aren't there, where are people going to teach? Not in my district. And then all of a sudden, I can't attract good teachers, so all of a sudden, nobody wants to live there, and they don't want to put their kids in our schools. And then it just starts moving down, just like I don't want to put my business in a place that has high property taxes. So we understand the concept. Just like accountability. No superintendent will ever say, get rid of all testing. That's crazy. We need to know whether people are succeeding. But we need diagnostic tests so that we can go back and fix it, because I can't fire the children. We actually have to keep them and keep going. So we're all about diagnostic. But rating us and blaming and shaming us is not going to get it done any better. And I know I better just, that was way over 2 minutes. Thank you.
So it sounds like you're not a big fan of the Senate bill. So let me ask you this.
Like I said, conceptually, I understand why they're doing what they're doing. But it's going to take all of us to explain what the difference is when you're dealing with little human beings.
So I guess my question to each of you before we do our call to action is, if you could design a compromise between these two bills, if you could design your perfect way to reform Texas public school finance, what would be the important elements in a bill? In 1 minute, no. We don't have much time, but really, let's talk about some of the key issues in it.
I could hit a minute. I think one of the key things is that you have something that is politically achievable. The Commission on School Finance proposal had the buy-in of the Speaker, the Lieutenant Governor, and the Governor. Some of those may have drifted since the adoption. Some may have had curveballs like a $5,000 across-the-board pay raise. But I think in the end, something that's accomplishable is more desirable than something that I might wish for or someone else might wish for. What's on the table is a substantial increase in spending on public education, ways in which you can lift student performance, ways in which you can create different ways of compensating people within public education, and also potentially ways in which you can improve affordability in places like Austin and Central Texas. So that's what I would say are key elements.
Chandra, do you want to weigh in on that one?
Do you want me to say like the perfect bill, or just like
sure,
a
why not? We can wave a magic wand, and you've studied this stuff for a long time. So if you could design your own perfect school finance reform bill, what would be the key elements?
Yeah, well, if I was the chairman of the School Finance Commission over the interim, the first thing I would have done would have been a cost study, because I think it's important to have a cost-based system. So I would start there and then make sure that all of the additional funding is very much student-directed. And that's one of the issues that I have with the outcomes-based funding. I think that we should look at today's students, see what resources they need to be successful, and then make sure that those resources benefit those particular students. So ensuring that we have very student-based focused funding. And then an income tax. I think that would help a little bit.
I hope she runs for office.
Kelly's your biggest fan.
Campaign manager.
Amanda?
So not very glamorous, but what I think schools need, honestly, is a stable, predictable revenue system. Yep. And so what I would ask that they think about is something, number one, that they can afford in the long term, and number two, that gives districts the information they need to budget thoughtfully and plan appropriately to put those programs and services in place that kids need. It's not glamorous, but it's just the hard work of every session coming back and being thoughtful about the decisions you make.
Brian, do you want to weigh in on this one? If you could design one that you think would be equitable and benefit Austin.
Well, I do think that there's a lot of stuff that's really good in the House bill that was proposed. Creating a weight for dyslexia students, weights for ELLs and dual language and students that aren't English language learners but still getting funding for being in a dual language program. So there's a lot of good stuff in there, and the House has said these are things that we think are priorities. The question will be, as we move forward and negotiations happen and we hear testimony and we want to change things or things need to be added, are they going to back off of those things that we've said were important from the beginning in order to add in some other things? So if we're going to do like a $5,000 across the board teacher raise, I think that's going to cost about $4 billion, I think they said. So if we're going to add that in there, are we going to take away from things that we said before were important? Or can we say, okay, $9 billion was a great start, and you want to add this in, well, let's add more funding in then to be able to fund those things that you want to add. So I don't have a perfect solution, but I think that we're already saying the things that we think are important: full day pre-K, funding full day pre-K, things like that. Let's not back off of those things in order to make room for other things to be added later. I think that $9 billion is a good start, but I think even more would be great. So.
Okay, now we really do have a time limit, Kelly. This is our call to action. What are some ways that all of us, the folks here today and perhaps the folks viewing on Facebook, what are some actual ways we can stay involved in this issue and be proponents of a more equitable education for everybody in Texas?
And in the interest of time, let's start at that end and move forward.
Okay, Brian, you're on.
Brian.
What is your call to action today for all of us?
Well, first off, I think it's great that everyone showed up on a rainy day to hear about this, because it is very important. I would say that legislators need to hear from you. They hear from us all the time, and especially in Austin, sometimes they're sick of hearing from us. But they want to hear from the voters. They want to hear from the parents. They want to hear from the businesses in the area. And so I would say a call to action is to take a minute to actually do that. There's a website you can go on, and I think if you Google who represents me, it'll actually let you know who represents you and give you their phone number, and take a second to call them. Have a story in mind, because they love to hear stories. Express to them why it's important that they put more funding into public education and how it would directly impact you or your child or your grandchild, or if you don't have kids, how it would impact the city. But it really is very important that they hear from all of you. And then, sorry, I'm going over a minute. And then the immediate action I would say is, if you have a pin, I want you to write down an email address real quick. So I'm not seeing pins being picked up.
Brian's email address?
Is Edna in here actually? Yeah. There's Edna. Edna's our legislative guru in AISD. I want you to write her email address down. It's
Edna, get ready.
Yeah. I'll give you her cell phone number afterwards. No, I did ask her ahead of time. This is okay. It's edna.butts@austinisd.org. And the reason why I want you to send her an email is because she sends a legislative update every week to anybody who's interested, and it's great. It highlights everything that's happened that week, but it also really talks about Austin and AISD specifically. So if you want to be more informed, I would suggest you sign up for Edna's legislative update, and it can help you to be able to have those conversations with folks if you're not as confident with the topic.
And we'll give out that in the post email we send out to everybody. We'll give that information as well. I'm saying I'm not going to be doing that, but Courtney. Okay, now you each have 10 seconds. No, I'm just kidding.
Sorry.
I can go fast. I would just say, as you're talking to your friends and neighbors, in your circles, think about being an ambassador for the whole system, and think about the needs not just of your children or your family's children, but of your whole city's children and of the state's children, and think about that as you talk to people about decisions about where they would want to send their kids to school and what kinds of services they're demanding, and about their tax burden, that we really have to build a system that works for all children in the state.
Yeah, and I'll just take my time to give a shout out to Just Fund It Texas. They're one of the sponsors today, and they are a grassroots movement of students and parents and taxpayers and concerned citizens who are really getting together to get informed and to mobilize at the legislature. So again, this is a group that's already formed and doing really great work. They have really in-depth resources and PowerPoints that you can set your own home parties, to teach your friends and neighbors all about the importance of school finance and how to get involved, but also to talk to your friends and neighbors and family members that don't live in Austin, because we have really great reps in the city who actually do care and are on the right page. So take this message to your family out in Odessa and Texarkana and the far reaches of the corner that aren't always, bombarded with the messaging that we are in Austin, sometimes being in the capital city.
And before we get to Drew and Kelly, I just want to tell everybody that there are postcards.
Give y'all a chance to run.
There are postcards on your table. These are provided by Just Fund It Texas. So before you go, this is a way we can all take action. Fill that out on the postcard. It asks you to express, how you feel about improving school finance and public education in Texas. So take time to do that, and that'll be a way you can take action. Sorry about that, Drew.
Great, thank you. So thank you to Leadership Austin for hosting this, and thanks to everybody for participating in the wonkiest topic this side of Medicare, Medicaid, and healthcare. I agree with I agree with Chandra that that we have a very strong delegation. They understand it and get it. You may want to figure out how to weigh in once there's discussion about how to reduce taxes. And then really your bigger impact is going to be locally. We've got a fantastic Austin ISD superintendent who, leading the board, has got some really tough choices in front of him. And the district has to make some changes. The board is engaged in doing it. This school district has had record academic performance. It's got a strong fiscal balance sheet, excellent financial leadership, best CFO I've seen since Kelly was in the biz. And so he's going to need your help. And these are tough decisions, and they're very emotional decisions for every reason that Kelly mentioned at the beginning about people's children. And those trustees are going to need your help in the coming weeks and months, and I hope you'll provide it. Thanks.
Kelly, 5 seconds. No, just kidding.
No,
I'm just
very
teasing.
well said. No,
No,
absolutely. Step outside your zone. We always kind of laugh when we go out, and when elected officials and superintendents, when we go out for public input, we know the answer. It's like rezoning. I got it. You don't want your kid moved. It's okay if other kids move, as long as my kid doesn't move. And then when I ask these people, that's great, we need to rezone as long as my kid isn't moved. We know the answer when it comes to what we want for ourselves. And the only way we're going to shake things up with the legislature and support districts like Austin that do have to make difficult decisions is step outside of your zone and say, you know what, this may not be great for me, but I actually care about what happens to the kids across the street or down the road or on the other side of town. And we almost never hear that. Almost never. When you testify and you call your legislator, they know what you're going to say. Freak them out a little, shake it up, step outside your zone, and go out there and say, you know what, this is important for a neighborhood I don't live in. This is important for a district that anywhere near mine, because that's the only way we're going to get something done. Otherwise, we're going to stay on the same sides we've been, because we all talk about equity and we all talk about how much we care about all children. But when we get down to it, our votes never change, do they? They never change. They haven't changed since I was a little girl. They're probably not going to change in the future unless we do something unusual to shake it up. This was fun.
Well, I've never had so much fun with school finance as I did this morning. I have two big thank yous. First of all, thank you all for driving in the rain, giving up part of your morning, and caring about this. I know you could be out hearing live music right now at South by Southwest, but you made a conscious choice to come learn about bettering education in our state, and that's important. And I want to say a huge thank you to all of you. I didn't realize you were going to be out late testifying last night and then have to turn around and do a breakfast. I love that you all came at this topic from a different lens and spoke from your heart and really talked about long-term and short-term solutions. So thank you all for being here today.